Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome back to Season 3 of the Logical Christian Podcast. I'm your Logical Christian, Dan Irwin. The Logical Christian Podcast is not here to tell you what to think. It's an exercise in how to think. Rather than just accept what we're being told with regard to current events, politics, science, religion, and everything else, we're going to stop the spin, ask questions, dive deep, and look at the world logically. And since logic is a gift from God, most importantly, we're going to look at it all as Christians. Links can be found in the show notes if you'd like to follow along. So with that, let's go be logical Christians. As AI, artificial intelligence, continues to improve with regard to voices, images, and the like, trying to distinguish between reality and whatever we're heading toward is getting harder and harder. If only there was some way to anchor ourselves to truth and fact and I don't know, it's just crazy thinking. On today's episode, first, we finally have something that proves God is real. Then we'll learn what happens when there's less monkey business and more business monkeys. And finally, I don't know, something Bible, something or other, probably not overly important. So get ready to finally experience real, true faith based on sight, just the way the good book intended. I'm pretty sure. Then put on a catcher's mask. Those little cute fellas have been known to rip off faces. And finally, maybe the good old days wouldn't be so bad. Now, defying all known laws of reality and a few of the lesser-known laws of physics, here we really go. 2 Corinthians 5:7. And you know what? Can I just pause for a moment? Every time I think of something like 2 Corinthians, I think of 2016. No, I didn't just know that date. I had to look up the date. When Trump was running for president the first time, he was at Liberty University giving a speech, and he said, 2 Corinthians. And I and so many others mocked him for not knowing how the Bible works. I mean, what a maroon. Well, some still mock him. Probably a few years after that I started moving toward the Reformed faith and was listening to some rock-solid pastors and preachers, and I noticed that particularly the Scottish pastors, or the UK pastors, Alistair Begg, Sinclair Ferguson, from Wales was Derek Thomas, and they all seemed to say things like 2 Corinthians or the like, rather than 1st or 2nd or 3rd, and I don't know why, but frankly, I owe who will hopefully, prayerfully, providentially be our 47th president, a sincere apology. I sure hope I didn't make him too sad by mocking him. Anyway, 2 Corinthians 5:7 says, depending on the translation, either that we live by faith or we walk by faith, not by sight. Or if you go to the Good News translation, it says, quote, for our life is a matter of faith, not of sight. Or, one of my favorites, the Hawaiian Pidgin Bible, which says, quote, the way we live, we trust God every time, no matter no can see him. Very true. However you say it, that verse, that concept, is a key to our belief system. After the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, he came and appeared before his disciples. And if you recall, Thomas, or as he became known, Doubting Thomas, wasn't there. When Thomas came back, the others told him that Jesus had been there. Thomas said, quote, unless I see in his hands the imprint of the nails, and put my finger into the place of the nails, put my hand into his side, I will not believe. Thus the doubting part. Well, 8 days later, the disciples were all again together, this time with Thomas, and Jesus appeared again. Jesus singled out Thomas and said, quote, bring your finger here and see my hands, and bring your hand here and put it into my side, and do not be unbelieving, but believing. The next verse does not tell us how Thomas went over and poked at Jesus and examined him, placed his finger in the nail holes, his hand in the wound in his side. It doesn't tell us how he did it or if he did it. It simply says, quote, Thomas answered and said to him, my Lord and my God. Now, did he go over and do all those things and we just weren't told? I mean, maybe, sure. But it doesn't sound like it, does it? The implication, at least from what I read, is that he knew beyond any doubt that this was his rabbi, or as he said, his Lord and his God. Jesus then replied, quote, because you have seen me, have you believed? Blessed are those who did not see and yet believed. See, the Christian life is one of faith, not sight. We don't require physical proofs to believe. We have faith, and our faith isn't of ourselves, right? Ephesians 2:8-9 says, for by grace are ye saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. Now, oftentimes people will attribute the term gift to the grace part of those verses, which grace is a gift of God. Absolutely, yes. But in that sentence, the term gift is actually tied to the word faith. God gives the Christian faith as a gift, the faith that we're saved by. This is a key understanding to the sovereignty of God. We don't have a little bit of good in us where we can make an agreement with God in our bit of faith to be saved. God does the work. And why? Well, so we have no room to boast, right? That's what we're told. If we have any hand in our salvation at all, we have room to boast about how smart we are or how good we are or whatever. No, see, God gives us faith. Hebrews 11, known as the Hall of Faith, gives us so much to think about regarding faith. Quote, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the men of old gained approval. By faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things which are visible." You and I exercise this faith in things that we can't see every day. I mean, can you see air, and yet you take your next breath? Can you see electrons? But you're fairly confident that the lights will turn on when you flip the switch. For most people, do you know how your car works? You trust that when you turn the key or push the button, it'll start. When you move the gear lever and push the pedal, it'll go. And the list is endless. Our lives function because we have faith. Every morning, I drive to work because although I can't see it from my house, I believe that my place of employment still exists in the same place, and that when I get there, my ID badge will somehow work when it gets close to the badge reader and the gate will open for me to go in. Now, the Reformed faith, or at least some in the Reformed faith, take the idea of belief through faith, not sight, very seriously, combining that with the second commandment, which, taken from Exodus 20, says, quote, "You shall not make for yourself an idol, or any likeness of what is in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them or serve them, for I, Yahweh your God, am a jealous God," and so on. They take these two concepts and completely and totally eschew any imagery in their churches or homes or wherever, any images of God or Jesus or anything like that. Now, I consider myself to be Reformed, to each their own, but I think they're being pretty ridiculous and silly in interpreting it that way. Assuming we get there in our long-term look at the Heidelberg Catechism that we're slowly working through, we'll eventually get to questions 96, 97, and 98. Briefly, this is what they say. Question 96, what does God require in the second commandment? Answer, that we in no wise make any image of God, nor worship him in any other way than he has commanded us in his word. Question 97, may we not make any image at all? Answer, God may not and cannot be imaged in any way. As for creatures, though they may indeed be imaged, yet God forbids the making or keeping any likeness of them, either to worship them or to serve God by them. And question 98, but may not pictures be tolerated in churches as books for the people? Answer, no, for we should not be wiser than God, who will not have his people taught by dumb idols, but by the lively preaching of his word. And frankly, I believe they're wrong. That's in no way how I would read the second commandment. Quote, you shall not make for yourself an idol, or any likeness of what is in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them or serve them. See, I read that as making an image to worship or serve. The commandment says don't make images, then says don't worship or serve them, which implies images are going to be made. They're going to exist. Otherwise, why say not to worship or serve them? Just stop at don't make them, right? As for the Heidelberg, there's a massive contradiction in their answer to question 97. The first part of the commandment says don't make any of these things. But then the Heidelberg says, well, okay, you can make some of these things, just not the God things. And don't worship the things you make. It's contradictory and nonsensical what they did with those questions, in my opinion. Now, that said, I do believe that we have no actual images of Jesus, because look at what some people do with the theoretical, artistic versions, the paintings, the sculptures, etc. We do see certain people, certain religions, who do like to worship these things as idols. to me. I have a few pictures in my house that depict Jesus. I like them. I don't worship them. But this is probably one of the reasons why we don't actually have a real painting or sculpture or any other sort of image of the real Jesus. We don't actually know what he looked like. But then we do get into those who do worship the images that are made, namely Orthodox religions, specifically the Catholics. Now, they say they don't worship idols, but their second commandment isn't the same as the Protestant second commandment, the one we just read, right? We agree on the first, no other gods. And then they kind of ignore the second and move 3 through 9 up a spot to become 2 through 8. And then they split the 10th commandment, which is basically don't covet. They split it into 2. Don't covet your neighbor's wife. Don't covet your neighbor's stuff. Again, that's ridiculous. I mean, come on. The Catholics absolutely worship idols. They worship images of Jesus. They definitely worship images of Mary. They worship images of the apostles, of people they've declared saints, and on it goes. And then you get into other things they worship, namely relics, or as I would call them, random junk. Because that's literally what a good percentage of these so-called relics are. I mean, the joke is that there have been so many pieces of the actual real cross of Jesus that are preserved or have been sold that you could make hundreds or thousands of complete crosses by now. And then we get to one relic that has been and is today worshipped and has baffled and confused so many Catholics, Protestants, and just generally curious people for nearly 700 years now. The Shroud of Turin. Now, this is a 14.5 foot by 3.5 foot piece of linen cloth. It was found around the year 1350, first displayed in France in 1354. It appears to have the image of a man front and back, as in the man was laid, feet at one end of the cloth on his back, legs together, hands crossed in front of him, and then the cloth pulled up over his head and laid across the front of him, thus the 14-foot length, right? The theory is that this is the burial shroud of Jesus. Why? Well, because primarily it has what appears to be the face of Jesus. Now, how do we know that this is the face of Jesus? Why, because it sure does look like the Europeanish, anglicized version of Jesus, and that is one of the biggest issues I have with it. We'll get to that. So it's been denounced a fraud by some. It's been venerated as true by others, as a relic. There were claims early on that the artist was known. There have been tests that have been run that say it dates back to around 55 AD, which would still be the wrong year, and that it came from the Middle East. There are others that tested it and said that it's a much more recent forgery. Still others say that it was a repaired section that was tested, not the original section, and that's why they get the wrong dates. Some say that the image is miraculous. There's no indication of any sort of anything that we know as artists' mediums. But then again, we have no idea how a lot of ancient things actually were done. And the arguments go on and on and on. Personally, I can tell you that I am 100% positive it's a fraud. Now, why do I say that? Because for it to be true, it also has to be magical. And although Jesus was fully God, he was fully man. There are no blood stains. There's nothing identified as blood on the shroud. There's reddish stains, a few of them, but those have been tested and they come back as iron oxide, rust, basically. They found DNA in the few samples that they tested, but the DNA came from people who were doing the testing. Looking at the image is too good. Either it was created in one of a number of possible man-made artistic ways that have been theorized through the years, or Jesus didn't just come back from the dead. He came back in some blazing radioactive flash of something or other. I don't know, which is possible. But we're not told anything like that. We're told there was an earthquake, a blazing light from the angels. That's all we're told. And it's not saying that that's, we have to be told everything, but we're not told that. There's been very little testing that's been allowed because this is a venerated ancient relic, and it's not allowed to be tested by the Catholic Church. So we're expected to believe it's real simply because we're told it's real. We're also told in the Bible, in both Luke and John, that Peter and John saw the linen wrappings laying there and the separate face cloth. Doesn't say anything about a shroud. It says wrappings. We know that the bodies were generally tightly wrapped in strips of linen in which spices and other fragrant things were packed. And interestingly, the New York Post, 2 months after they published a sister article to the one we're about to look at, actually published just a few days ago. They did apparently a computer 3D rendering of this cloth on a body, and it says that there's no way a human body could have resulted in that kind of a perfect image. It would have had to have been made by some sort of very flat, very thin relief or some other artistic method. But the most unrealistic part of the shroud, in my opinion, is actually the topic of our article, found on theblaze.com. Headline, AI has shown us the face of Christ. Will it bring more to the faith? Now, the gist of the article is that for some reason, this shroud has jumped back up in popularity as of late, and it seems to do this from time to time, and that science, long trying to disprove God, the enemy of God, which I guess I'm not going to argue that, has actually proven this shroud came from the actual Jesus. Now, how did it do that? Well, someone who doesn't matter fed the image of the shroud into some artificial intelligence image generating program, a program that doesn't matter, and it spit out, quote, what may be the most accurate depiction of Christ's face. Now, the author of this article, Kevin Ryan, and let's be honest, dude's got 2 first names. He's already shady. Regardless, I don't doubt his sincerity. Kevin Ryan, I would guess, is probably a Catholic. I don't care enough to dig into that, but that would be my guess. I'll tell you why in a minute. He begins his article with, quote, every generation gets to choose whether or not to abandon Christianity. In 2,000 years, no generation has fully walked away. And that's true. Christianity has been hated and maligned since the time of the first church, but it never has, nor will it ever disappear. It's just not going to happen. Truth is truth. It's not going to go away. But now, quote, the lines between myth and reality are blurring. Science, once believed to be Christianity's greatest adversary, is suddenly taking a seat at the table of faith. And although I agree that true science is absolutely simpatico with Christianity, the science that our author is talking about is not taking a seat at the table of faith. They're 180 degrees apart, and they always will be, by design. So AI developed the human image of Jesus based on the shroud, because AI can do anything, right? I mean, that's what we're trying to be told. That's what we're trying to be convinced of. Quote, it's a face that's both familiar and new. The long hair, the beard, the haunting eyes that seem to look into not just the world, but each of us individually, deeply. Which, sure, it's a nice picture. Very realistic looking. Very anglicized looking. Very, very similar to what I believe is the most famous painting of Jesus ever. It seems like everyone had one. I think if I remember right, as a little kid, I had a small, I think it was a little plastic picture or a little frame picture. I don't remember exactly, but it was some sort of screen printing something on there, and it was that picture. This is Jesus's portrait. He's looking off to our right or his left. It's just kind of a bust type of picture, so it shows the top of his shoulders, his simple white tunic. He's got the blue eyes, the wavy shoulder-length hair, perfectly trimmed beard, European nose and facial structure. It's a fantastic picture. And if you didn't have one, you had a relative or a friend who did. It's called the Head of Christ, or Salmon's Head, or Salmon Head, something like that, painted originally in 1940 by American artist Warner Salmon. Now, Salmon first did a charcoal sketch in 1924 for a youth publication, and it became popular, so in 1940 he painted the oil version that we all know. It exploded in popularity during World War II as small versions were handed out to the soldiers as they were leaving to fight over in Europe and Asia. Of course, the cry for the last 70 years is that it depicts a white Jesus. Which it does. There's no question about that. And this AI-generated image of the Shroud of Turin, well, that face looks nearly identical to this painting, just maybe a bit more forlorn, a little bit more haggard, but still very similar, incredibly handsome, which we're told in Isaiah 53, quote, he has no stately form or majesty that we should look upon him, nor appearance that we should desire him. And the painting and the AI recreation, like I said, that's a good-looking man right there. Now, back in 2002, a British scientist worked with a team of Israeli archaeologists to use forensic anthropology to analyze the skulls of first-century Jews. They utilized a forensics computer program, fed in all of the data they collected, and they came up with a composite image of a first-century Jewish man, just the head. Okay, the face is wider than the famous painting. The hair is short and curly. The beard is kind of bushy. The nose is more bulbous, and so on and so on. The image that was created was just of a plain, average guy. No appearance that would cause someone to desire him. No stately form or majesty. Just an average-looking Jewish guy. Personally, I think out of all the depictions I've seen of Jesus, if I had to pick one that I thought would be closest to what Jesus looked like, I would go with the image developed by the team of forensic scientists, experts in this very specific scientific field of recreation. Back to our article. Quote, "The irony is hard to miss. The very tool we feared might render faith obsolete has given us the most human image of Jesus yet. Science, thought to replace God, is now part of the process that brings us back to Him. As we hurtle deeper into the digital age, we've been conditioned to seek meaning in data, in pixels and screens, in algorithms that shape our reality. And yet these same tools are leading us back to questions that are profoundly ancient. The face of Christ, now digitized and rendered in high definition, serves as a reminder. The divine is not so easily replaced." And I just got to say, I never feared personally that science was going to go and, steal me away from Jesus. It's not going to replace God. I also don't look at science as being the thing that's going to bring people back to Him. But let's go on here. He goes into a brief discourse regarding faith being about belief, not sight. That's how we started the segment. And then he writes, quote, "While we may never confirm the shroud's authenticity beyond a shadow of a doubt, the mere possibility forces us to grapple with something bigger. Faith isn't about what's seen, it's about what transcends sight. And sometimes, when technology allows us to glimpse the mysteries of old, it invites us to marvel rather than dismiss. As AI constructs the face of Christ and science re-examines ancient relics, the digital world and the divine collide in unexpected ways. We aren't abandoning faith, we're rediscovering it through the very tools meant to replace it. Tools that allow us to stare deeply into that unmistakable face, those never-ending eyes, and seen." Sounds great, doesn't it? Yeah, you know what I did? I went to a random AI image generator and I said, Jesus, if he was a bunny rabbit. And you know what I got? I got a mix of Jesus, basically the one in the famous painting with the never-ending eyes, and the nose and whiskers and pointy ears of a bunny. I asked it to make, quote, "the true face of Jesus." And it did, another form, more Norse-looking maybe, more like Viking-ish, I would say, of that famous painting. I typed in, quote, "Jesus if he was born a Jew," and we got that same Jesus, this time with some sort of a vine headband like the crown of thorns, sans thorns, sitting on the ground holding a baby, appearing to be forcefully playing with the baby's lips. The baby's face was kind of all contorted. It was weird. AI is weird. I put in, quote, "Jesus as a transformer." I got a transformer of some sort. I didn't see Jesus in there. I got a transformer. I put in, quote, "Jesus if he was a fast motorcycle." I got some scraggly older man riding an inline 4-cylinder cruiser bike, and he's wearing a bike, like a bicycle helmet, and a red cape for some reason. And I could just spend days putting in combinations and letting AI generate things for me. And most of what I tried were variations of the anglicized or white Jesus in that very famous painting, which is what AI generated based on the shroud to tell us what the image on the shroud would have looked like. Here's my point. AI isn't smart. It isn't intelligent. AI is a computer program. It's a very fast, very energy-intensive, high-computing computer program, but it's a program nonetheless. all it knows is what it's been trained on. And all it's been trained on is what the overseers of the computer program have given it. If you Google the face of Jesus, most of what you'll get is a variation of basically a white Jesus, a variation of that famous painting. And that's what AI has to go off of in order to recreate the shroud. See, AI knows what the shroud is claimed to be because it would have that information as part of the data dump that it's trained on. It would know all the versions of Jesus that have been painted or drawn or sculpted or otherwise imaged all through the centuries because the data dump would have had that kind of background information in it. And what it did is it took the outline of the shroud, the outline of the image of the shroud, it filtered it through the bits of data about what Jesus looks like, and then it recreated a photorealistic image of a composite of these images, fitting it into the boundaries of the shroud. This may be computer science, but it's not magic and it's not a miracle. I said the author of this article was likely Catholic, and I said that because of the reverence he was giving the shroud and the ability of a computer-generated image of an unproven supposed relic to bring people to faith. It's not how faith works. If I were a betting man, and I'm not, as far as you know, I'd bet that I could count on one hand how many people have come to a genuine, saving knowledge of Jesus Christ because of the shroud. And I'd further bet I could have a horrible table saw accident on said hand and on said fingers, and coming out with less than the customary 5 fingers, if you count the thumb as a finger, and I absolutely do, and I could still use that hand to count how many people have been legitimately brought to repentance and faith in Christ because of the shroud. Now, Jesus did miracles while he was on the earth as proof that he was who he said he was. It wasn't to bring people to a point of faith. It was proving himself to be true in a skeptical world. There was a point, and it had ties back to the Old Testament. It was done for a reason. The apostles, for a short time, also did miracles for the same reasoning, to show that they were legitimately sent by God, by the Messiah, to preach the good news. Miracles still happen today. But those are up to God, when and where and how he'd like for those to occur. And from all accounts, they're incredibly rare. I know that there are some, denominations, I don't know what you want to call them, and they claim miracles all the time. They're liars. Anyway, belief or faith is not brought about through signs, wonders, or relics. This is why some don't like books like A Case for Christ. I'll admit, I got a few chapters into it, and I quit. It just did not hold my interest at all. A lot of people have read it, and they love it. It's, from what I understand, kind of a scientific, proof-based book to prove that God exists. Now, I think there is some merit to examining, this creation in that manner for that purpose. I don't find anything wrong with that necessarily, but that's not what brings about faith. Remember, Romans 1 tells us, quote, "For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, both his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse." Man knows that God exists simply by looking around. No elaborate science, no investigative reporting, no AI recreations are needed. We all know just because we exist. And then Romans 10 goes on and it says this, quote, "For Moses writes about the righteousness which is of the law, the man who does these things shall live by them. But the righteousness of faith speaks in this way, do not say in your heart, who will go up into heaven, that is to bring Christ down, or who will go down into the abyss, that is to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is, the word of faith, which we are preaching, that if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart a person believes, leading to righteousness, and with the mouth he confesses, leading to salvation. For the scripture says, quote, whoever believes upon him will not be put to shame. For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all, abounding in riches for all who call on him. For whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? How will they believe in him whom they have not heard? And how will they hear without a preacher? And how will they preach unless they are sent? Just as it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who proclaim good news of good things. However, they did not all heed the good news. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our report? So faith comes from hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. The preaching of the gospel is what brings about faith. And remember, faith, pre-Ephesians 2:8-9, which I mentioned earlier, is a gift which comes solely from God, so that pride in how smart or how good or how theologically astute we are is removed from the equation. God works in mysterious ways. Why do we need to pray if God already knows everything? Because God told us to. Why do we need to tell others the good news? Why do we need churches or pastors if God is the one who grants the gift of faith to whomever he will? Because God has chosen the preaching of the gospel to be the vehicle he uses to grant a person faith and bring them to salvation. God doesn't need us to do any of this, but he commands us to do these things as part of his ultimate plan. The speculation as to why could take hours to work through, but suffice it to say that this is how God has designed it. And there is clearly benefit to both the born-again individual that's praying, preaching, witnessing to others, and there is benefit to the unsaved person who is being prayed for, who is listening, who is learning. Now, AI is a fascinating tool, but it's not needed, nor, I predict, will it even be a blip on the radar, as it were, of Christianity. If anything, I would predict that it would be more of a hindrance because of the religious leaning, or lack thereof, of those generally in charge of controlling the teaching and maintaining of the systems. Faith is a gift of God, through which, by God's grace, you are saved upon hearing the word of Christ preached to you or told to you by someone who was sent for that express purpose to tell, so you can hear in order to believe. No relic, no physical proofs, no computer program, nothing this world has to offer could ever or will ever do what the perfect plan of God already perfectly accomplishes. From Wikipedia, quote, "The infinite monkey theorem states that a monkey hitting keys at random on a typewriter keyboard for an infinite amount of time will almost surely type any given text, including the complete works of William Shakespeare. In fact, the monkey would almost surely type every possible finite text an infinite number of times. The theorem can be generalized to state that any sequence of events that has a non-zero probability of happening will almost certainly occur an infinite number of times given an infinite amount of time or a universe that is infinite in size." Now, I would bet that most, if not all of you, have heard some version of the infinite monkey theorem, and it does take various forms. Sometimes it's one monkey with a typewriter, sometimes it's infinite monkeys with infinite typewriters, but it's always set in infinite time. So let's take one monkey, one typewriter, infinite time. Could that monkey type even one work of Shakespeare in that amount of time, not to mention all his works and all written works ever written, and then do it an infinite number of times? Well, in theory, absolutely. And the reason that theory works is the word that's been said so many times at this point, infinity. But before we go there, let's do just a little bit of math. Not a whole lot, don't worry. This is mostly rudimentary probability, mostly. So looking at an old manual typewriter keyboard, at the keys that actually do something, which include the tab and the space bar and the backspace, but not necessarily the shift key, and we'll ignore the shift lock key for now. So with all those boundaries set, the old-timey mechanical typewriter keyboard has 47 keys, depending on the keyboard, but that gives us a good start. If you plop a monkey down in front of a keyboard, the probability that he'll strike any key is basically 1 out of 1. If we don't care which key he hits, there's essentially no chance that he won't eventually hit a key. But if we want him to hit a specific key, and we're going to ignore the requirements to capitalize letters for this thought exercise, at least for now, the odds of him hitting the correct key, the one we want, is 1 out of 47. So think of this as a fraction, 1 over 47. If you do the math, he's already at a 2.1% chance that he'll hit the key he needs to hit without hitting any other keys first. So then, let's expand that and let's take my name, Dan, D-A-N. That's 3 specific letters in a specific sequence. That's 1 over 47 times 1 over 47 times 1 over 47, or 1 divided by 47 cubed, which is 1 chance out of 103,823 possibilities that he would hit the correct keys in the correct order. So that comes out to a 0.00096% chance that he could type my name. If you require him to hold the shift key to give me a capital D, then release it again for a small a and a small n, then that's 5 distinct actions that must be done in a specific order, which is 1 over 47 to the 5th power, or 1 over 229,345,007, or 0.00000044% chance that he could type my name correctly in one try. That's one very tiny word. The shortest Shakespearean play has 14,701 words. Remember, that's words, not letters. Each of those words has a specific number of letters, and each letter of each word in that book must be placed in the correct location on the first try with the correct capitalization, etc. Can you see how the concept of infinity must be evoked in order to make this theory work? To draw a parallel, I heard a comedian from a few years ago talk about the $1 billion Powerball lottery, if you remember all the scuttlebutt about that one. So without checking his numbers, I'm just kind of assuming that he's right, he said that your odds of winning that Powerball was 1 in 300 million. That's about 33% worse odds than a monkey typing my name correctly. But here's how he illustrated it. He said that there are about 900 million people on the North American continent, which equates to roughly 300 million households. So imagine the lottery board put $1 billion in a box and place that box in a room, and that room is in one of the houses in North America. When you buy your ticket, you're given one chance to pick the correct address where that box resides. Are we jiving with the idea of how massive these probabilities are? See, our perception of reality has been Overton windowed. It's been shifted so hard that even the ridiculous now sounds commonplace, right? The term infinity holds absolutely no meaning to our minds outside of a mathematical concept because our minds can't truly comprehend infinity or eternity. We can contemplate it, but we can't understand it. And numbers like 300 million are really fairly incomprehensible to most of us, as are, say, $36 trillion of debt, as is 0.00000044% chance of something happening. The bigger the numbers get, or the smaller the numbers get, the less comprehension we have of them. So the more we just accept them without thinking about them, mostly because thinking isn't really going to help, the more science can do what science does. Now, I mentioned $36 trillion in debt. We're just about there as a country, and our minds can't comprehend what that means for the United States of America. But if you go to usdebtclock.org, you can see our national debts, our spending, all sorts of things, just numbers just ticking and rolling along. That nearly $36 trillion in debt, to make it make more sense to you and I, means that every single person in the United States, every man, woman, child, baby, as of the second that I typed these words, we all owed $106,519. That's a number that most people can fathom. That's a realistic, theoretical type of number of the amount of money that we would each have to pay to the government to pay off the debt. And by the time I record this, it'll probably be another few dollars, most likely, and by the time this actually drops, probably another couple dollars beyond that. Now, I'm not sure how fast that number's rising, to be honest, but that's my guess. Now, to put this in a more realistic way, if you're a taxpayer, because let's be honest, the kids, the babies, right? You've got elderly who are living on fixed incomes. They're not going to be able to pay $106,519. So if you're a taxpayer, which a large number of citizens are not, well, the taxpayers owe $272,820. Again, this is a number that your mind can handle. Okay, gone a long way down a rabbit trail, maybe the most glorious digression the world has ever seen. Let's meander back to where this started, typing monkeys. And after we talk about typing monkeys, we're going to dive into a few different, completely unrelated, but absolutely related areas, and hopefully all this comes together at the end. Okay, so monkeys. Found on phys.org, headline, typing monkey would be unable to produce Hamlet within the lifetime of the universe. Study finds. All right, Hamlet is the most wordy of the Shakespearean plays at 30,557 words. Think of how many letters that may entail. I can tell you that stopping at the end of that last sentence, I had typed 1,073 words in this script, which came out to 6,214 characters, not to mention letters or symbols that require the shift key, and that comes out to about 5.8 characters per word on average. So let's say that Hamlet, at 30,557 words, average of 5.8 letters per word, not worried about capitalization, that's 177,230 letters. The probability of a monkey typing all that, ignoring capitalization, is 1 over 47 to the 177,230th power, and that's on an old-timey keyboard, not a much more involved computer keyboard. Now, when I try to do 47 to the 177,230th power on my Microsoft Windows computer calculator.exe, I get invalid input. When I put that value into my Texas Instruments TI-85 emulator app on my phone, I get error, result is too big. Trying to do it in Excel, I get a number error. And when I try to put it in Google, it doesn't even recognize that I'm asking for it to do a calculation. The point is that it's statistically impossible, unless you use the incomprehensible and totally theoretical idea of infinity to fix your statistical problem. In theory, everything is possible if you use infinity. Now, in reality, there are things that are not possible even in infinity, but monkeys typing Shakespeare is theoretically possible given infinity. So, the study that I found on phys.org says that it's impossible for a monkey to bang out Hamlet within the lifespan of our universe. Now, the finite time limit reveals the impossibility of the premise. A couple mathematicians, professors from the University of Technology, Sydney, Stephen Woodcock and Jay Folletta, did a mathematical study using a finite time limit and one monkey, then a finite time limit and the estimated number of chimpanzees in the world today, 200,000. They used a typing speed of 1 keystroke per second and used the theoretical lifespan of this universe of 10 trillion years. What they calculated is, I think, kind of mind-blowing, at least to this chimp. They calculated a 5% chance that a single chimpanzee could type the word bananas in its entire lifetime, which on average is about 33 years. Bananas, 7 letters, 33 years, 5% chance. They found that there was basically no chance of 200,000 chimps working for 10 trillion years that they could reproduce all 884,647 words of the complete works of Shakespeare in the correct order. Increasing typing speed, increasing the chimp population made essentially no difference. And narrowing it down to just Hamlet resulted in the same possibility, essentially 0. The author ends the article shortly after revealing these statistics by saying this, quote, "In the era of generative AI, the infinite monkey theorem and its finite version perhaps also challenge readers to consider philosophical questions around the nature of creativity, meaning, and consciousness, and how these qualities emerge." How the qualities emerge. He's almost there. In fact, the author is on the right track with this problem. If you take the infinite monkey theory, place any boundary you'd like on it that removes the theoretical concept, the mathematical savior, if you will, of infinity, well, the theory collapses. This is a scientific statistical result that should be applied to other realms of seemingly impossible things. I want to briefly address two main tracks that this article, or more accurately this study, kind of springboards us into. One being evolution, the other is science in general. So looking at evolution, I did some asking of Bing's Copilot, that's their AI assistant, to help me with some numbers and statistics and values that I've searched for in the past, but apparently are really hard to find. I knew that AI, being a supercharged search engine, could find this faster than I could. So I asked it what the statistical probability is for life to have evolved on Earth. Came back with two theories. One is called the principle of mediocrity. Kind of sounds like a principle I can get on board with. This theory is an infinite monkey theory. However, in this theory, they basically assume that there are infinite planets, which out of infinity planets, you obviously have infinite planets with Earth-like habitability, which means you have infinite opportunities for life to spontaneously generate, which means that there are likely infinity Earth-like planets within the infinite universe that are currently teeming with life. What that theory does is place our existence into a category of meh, right? We're just nothing special, right? The odds say that there's no way we couldn't evolve here. This theory uses a lot of assumptions and, of course, the principle of infinity to calculate a statistical probability that's absolutely baseless, illogical, and useless. In short, this is a stupid theory. The other theory is the rare Earth hypothesis. This one is a bit closer to reality. This theory looks at all the factors that must be in place for life to generate here. The sun at the right size and temperature and radioactive level and stability. The Earth at the correct distance with the exact rotation and orbit that it has. The moon at the right distance with the correct orbital speed. The atmosphere that we have, and on and on and on. All of these factors. Then it looks at the probability of life spontaneously generating from some electrical charge in a pond of goo. At the end of everything, they place the probability at 1 chance out of 10 to the 24th power, or 1 in 1 septillion. Now, I think that's probably estimating a little too high. I think they're giving it a little too much of a chance of being true. I think the odds are actually much worse. In fact, I think to make this more accurate, they need to factor in the probability that life only spontaneously generates one time on this planet. I mean, in theory, there's no reason lightning can't hit brackish goo water multiple times, including today, and start evolution again in that goo water. The fact that we don't have multiple living missing links today, if evolution is true, that are based on various stages of evolution from various starting points, kind of points to how silly of a theory evolution is. I think if you factored in what we don't see as well as what we do, the probability adjusts even lower. But using their figure, the savior again is time. Not infinite time, just a long time. In fact, time is the Christ figure for evolution. It is the miracle worker. It is the savior. If ever something doesn't seem to fit, they just adjust time to make it fit. How many articles have we discussed where this such and such discovery rewrites the evolutionary timeline, or some such nonsense? Well, it doesn't rewrite it. It just spreads this part of the timeline out or shoves that event farther back into the past, because just as we have no concept of infinity, when we really have no grasp of trillions of dollars, we also can't really fathom billions of years. So science just adjusts things within the ridiculously inflated timeline in order to make it sound scientific and stop the vast majority of humanity from putting any real thought into it because, well, I mean, science says so. And look at those numbers. I mean, who am I to argue with science? I'm no scientist. Going back to our Bing Copilot, I asked it how the estimated age of the universe has increased over the last 250 years. Remember, time, large amounts of time, is what's needed for the evolutionary theory to appear plausible. So if you go back earlier than what I asked Bing, you'll find that man believed the Bible, that the universe was 6,000 to 10,000 years old, somewhere in there, and then slowly that crept into the tens, then the hundreds of thousands of years. Then by the 18th century, this idea of an ancient universe started rearing its unscientific head, so millions of years started being bandied about. By the early 20th century, you had some who believed the universe was simply just eternal. And you had others, heavily influenced by Edwin Hubble and his expanding universe of the Big Bang Theory, who started to backwards calculate from the size of the current universe to the size of the universe at the time of the Big Bang, and they came up with a 1.8 to 2 billion year old universe, being the first calculated value. That was in the 1950s. Only a decade later, in the 1960s, the scientists and mathematicians sharpened their pencils and revised that to 10 billion years old, from 2 to 10 billion years old in only 10 years. Then, in the 1990s, so 30 years later, we launched the Hubble telescope, which theoretically gave us more precision. So then we calculated 13 billion years old. The 2000s gave us more technology, more precision, and a revised number of 13.7 billion years old. The 2010s slightly revised that number to 13.8 billion years old. Interestingly, as a side note, as the age of the universe increased dramatically and rapidly over time, the size of the ball that all the matter in the universe was scrunched into at the time of the Big Bang kept getting smaller. It was estimated as a ball light years across originally, and then billions of miles across, and then millions, etc., with the prevailing theory today being that everything, and I want you to really let that word sink in, everything in the entire universe, all matter, because matter cannot be created nor destroyed, so all matter in the entire universe was actually smashed down into a ball the size of nothing. That is literally what so-called science tells us today, that everything was compressed so tightly, so small, it wasn't. It was nothing. It turned into nothing. Now, maybe it's just my unscientific mind. But does that sound scientific, possible, plausible, logical, or even sane? But just as massively inflated values trick the mind into shutting off and just chalking it up to science that we can't understand, infinitesimally small values do the same thing. So back to the age of the universe. Over time, we've moved from thousands to millions to now 13.8 billion years. That seems long enough to fit all this evolution stuff in there, except that, last year, for example, found on phys.org, again, headline, new research puts age of universe at 26.7 billion years, nearly twice as old as previously believed. So this study was completed mid-2023, and in case you missed it, you can go back, read all about it in your archived copy of the journal Monthly Notices of the Royal Astronomical Society, which I can almost guarantee that you, as do I, have a dedicated shelf or an entire bookcase for the issues of said journal. Bottom line, the age of the Earth has been calculated basically the same way it was calculated around the time of Hubble's expanding universe theory, backward calculating to point to a Big Bang, right, to get back to a Big Bang, with allegedly more accurate measurements of distance and speed. With an ever-shrinking starting point, that number has ballooned, much to the delight of evolutionists, to 13.8 billion years old. But there were still a few problems. I mean, way more than a few. I would argue infinity problems, but they only cite a few. Those being the existence of stars that, quote, appear to be older than the estimated age of our universe, and also what they've termed or deemed, quote, early galaxies in an advanced state of evolution. To put this in sciencey terms, they've now claimed to have seen, with the new James Webb Telescope, galaxies from only 300 million years after the Big Bang that appear to be billions of years old by their advanced, mature evolutionary state. So blah, 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 mumbling in sciencey talk, chalk flying, lab coats ruffling, and Bob's your uncle, 26.7 billion years old. And the world of evolution collectively plots, thinking about what they could do with an additional 13 billion years of evolution to play with. Do you have any idea what scientific claims could be made with 13 billion more years? I mean, hashtag job security, am I right? Now again, as a side note, they claim to have seen galaxies only 300 million years old, only 300 million years after the Big Bang, by using the James Webb Telescope. A while back, I discussed this in a segment and said that looking back through time, that this claim didn't make much sense to me. Just because you have better optics doesn't mean you see farther back in time. Now, I've given that some thought. Let me slightly revise what I said. Let me try to illustrate what I'm thinking here. So we know that it takes 8 or 9 minutes for the sun's light to hit the Earth. So when you look at the sun, which, I mean, what are you doing? Didn't anyone tell you not to stare at the sun? But when you look at the sun, you're seeing it as it was 8 or 9 minutes ago. If you take a telescope, aim it at the sun and look through that, first of all, your eye socket will be a smoking crater where your eyeball used to be, so don't do this. But hypothetically, if you used a telescope to look at the sun, you're not seeing it any sooner. You're just seeing it bigger or closer. You're still seeing light from 8 to 9 minutes ago, just bigger and brighter. And the problem is that your telescope hasn't moved closer to the sun. You and the telescope are essentially viewing the light from the same location in space. Now, get in a SpaceX Starship using SpaceX's super heavy lift launch vehicle and propel yourself toward the sun. If you go half the distance between the Earth and the sun, look at it again. Again, the burning crater eye socket thing, but hypothetically, you'll see the sun as it was about 4 minutes ago. Now, raise the heat shields, land on the sun, then look at it. Just go with me here. You'll see the sun as it is now, right? Then, now and then. The difference is the distance you are from the sun. Okay? You with me so far? So theoretically, the Earth is a long distance from event 1, the epicenter of what's thought to be the point of the Big Bang. Now, if you were to go look up how far we are from the Big Bang center, just don't. It's not worth it. This is such a convoluted mess. One site says we're about 17 million light years from the Big Bang. A light year is 5.9 trillion miles, so that works out to a long way. I'll let you melt your calculator into a smoking pile of plastic. Another site says that we're silly for thinking there's a central point, that the Big Bang was all points exploding at all the same time, and so we're right where we are, which is where the Big Bang for us happened, or something. I don't know. Problem is, that also blows up the expansion theory, which is how they set the age of the universe, but the Big Bang has been falling out of favor for a number of years now anyway, because it doesn't work with what they're seeing anymore. Anyway, we're light years off course with that digression. The point is, we're far away from the Big Bang. Maybe. Theoretically. Maybe not, but maybe. And the farther away we are from something, the longer it takes for light to travel for us to see it. So if you move closer, you'll see light closer to the origin of that light. So in theory, we can sort of look back in time, relatively speaking. My guess is that they're saying they see this 300 million year old galaxy with the James Webb because it has better optics and can collect more light and focus more clearly than the Hubble could, because that's the only way they could claim that the James Webb could do this, because it isn't any closer, theoretically, to the theoretical origin than the Hubble is, relatively speaking. So, look, I sort of see what they're saying about looking back in time, but the light still has to travel to the optics of the telescope, right? The telescope can't go out and grab light particles and bring it back faster. It has to wait for light to reach it. So if this galaxy is 300 million years old, and the Earth is 17 million light years away, and the James Webb is closer, but only like a million miles closer than the Earth, and the Big Bang happened 13.8 or possibly 26.7 billion years ago, I don't think these numbers add up. Do they? Am I wrong here? There's something wrong here, and I think science knows it and either doesn't care or they're just ignoring it, because to admit these problems means that none of their origin theories actually work. But again, this is the typing monkey theory. The evolutionist will tell you that it's long ages. It's a massive universe. Everything was infinitesimally small, and by using not quite infinity, but very big or very small numbers, they can get away with calling it science and say that statistically, the probability of XYZ thing occurring is very high given the large number of years. So the concept of evolution fairly easily parallels to the infinite monkey theory. But what about science in general? See, science, or what passes for science these days, it uses the same kind of idea, the just trust us kind of mentality. How many times have you heard the phrase, science has shown, or science has proven, or the majority of scientists agree, or something like that? And we just accept it because they, being scientists, they do all the heavy lifting, so we don't have to, right? So, kind of rapid fire, here's what science is telling us today, what we're expected to believe, and what so many people are believing simply because science says so. Found on Marca, M-A-R-C-A, Marca.com, headline, NASA confirms the date of the end of the world that Stephen Hawking predicted. Confirms. That's an interesting word, isn't it? Apparently, Stephen Hawking, who died about 6 years ago now, which I didn't think it was that long ago, who sported an IQ of 160, which, I mean, that's okay if that's all you can pull off. Just as an aside here, the average IQ in the United States is 98, and that explains so much. Although, to be honest, I'll argue that you don't have to have a high IQ in order to be smart. There is something to be said for wisdom, which we'll touch on here later, and common sense over your IQ book smarts. Anyway, Stephen Hawking predicted that the Earth would be a, quote, gigantic ball of fire by the year 2600. Now, why did he say that? Well, because he doesn't understand science or how the world works, to be honest. And yes, I know it's presumptive of me to say that. But look, a number of years ago, I took an online IQ test and I came out with a 123. I'm doing okay here, right? Seriously. His prediction was based on, quote, global warming, climate change, and the greenhouse effect as the main culprits for the disappearance of the Earth. So he was a believer in unconstrained linear global warming because of humans, despite all the scientific evidence that would suggest that that is highly improbable. But now NASA has confirmed this, except, quote, it is true that the Aerospace Organization does not give a specific date to pinpoint the end of the world, but it does say that if human beings continue at this rate of depleting energy resources, they will bring about their end sooner than many expect. If urgent action is not taken, the disappearance of our planet will be inevitable. Okay, so they didn't confirm anything, actually. In fact, they're not even looking at it from the same viewpoint. He's looking at it from a climate death. They're looking at it from an energy depletion standpoint. And he put a time and they didn't put a time. It's not the same. And yet the headline says that they confirmed it. Even worse, they have no proof that we're depleting anything, to be honest. Every time we're given some prediction about how we're almost out of oil or whatever, then the largest oil deposit in the history of mankind is found again. There are some who theorize that oil is actually just a substance that keeps generating underground. It's not old plants, animals, and dinosaurs like the prevailing theory says. I don't know. I think we may be seeing a bit of both, to be honest, at this point. But what I do know is that we don't appear to be anywhere close to running out of energy. But, of course, the money that flows in from climate alarmism is too good. Science says it, so it must be so. Moving to livescience.com, headline, the universe had a secret life before the Big Bang, new study hints. Ooh, sounds naughty. You naughty universe, you. This is a theory that says the Big Bang may not have been the beginning of the universe, that the universe just kind of bounces between expansion and contraction. Now, this gets into dark matter and black holes and quantum fluctuations and transition periods between expansion and contraction, and frankly, it's just more hogwash, really. So in the grand scheme of things, this isn't really worth going into. The bottom line is that science, once again, isn't doing science, and the science they've done in the past is starting to fall apart the more they learn and dig into it. And I've had debates with people that this is how science works. You hypothesize, test, disprove your hypothesis, rehypothesize, and continue the cycle. And yes, that's true, except that when is the last time you heard a popular, I don't know if I can use that term, scientist say that evolution is just a theory, or that it's one of a few major theories, or that climate change is just a theory? No, these are presented as scientific fact, and they just aren't. They aren't fact. We also knew, per science, that disease resided in the blood, and the only way to get that out is to let the blood out. And George Washington would be alive today had they not drained most of his blood. Yeah, you heard me. Science also told us that blacks were less evolved and closer to apes than whites, so they could be treated more as animals, and they really needed to be disposed of so as to not contaminate the human race. Science has told us many things because they claim superiority of intellect. They eschew religious texts as being stories and myths for the weak-minded, and they overall don't actually do any science. Let's go to one of my favorite headlines thus far, found on notthebee.com. Headline, peer-reviewed study on benefits of scientific rigor gets retracted for lack of scientific rigor. Apparently in 2023, a study was published that said scientific rigor can lead to replicable results. Basically, this was a study that said if you use the scientific method, hypothesize, test, analyze, adjust your hypothesis, test, analyze, until you can get to a point where your hypothesis appears to mimic reality, thus you can use what you've discovered for something. So the study said that if you use that method, that's good science. Yes, that is science. And one of the benefits of doing science this way, and one of the qualifications for scientific discovery, is repeatability. Can you or can anyone repeat the result that you got by following what you did? The problem is that they didn't actually do a rigorous study. They basically did a cursory study, decided they liked the results, sent it off for peer review, which is an absolute farce at this point. It's been repeatedly proven that the peer review system is a failure, full of fraud, lies, and palm grease. So they used the sketchy study, had it peer reviewed, which means nothing, published the findings, and then someone called them on the fact that their study on rigor grossly lacked rigorous scientific study. And that's funny, except that also found on notthebee.com. Headline, you should follow the legal case of a medical journal that is being sued for retracting studies on the risks of abortion pills. Not the Bee quotes the Daily Wire, quote, 10 scientists are suing an academic journal that retracted major studies on the potential harm of abortion pills, saying that the retractions were politically motivated. The Charlotte Lozier Institute scientists, represented by the Alliance Defending Freedom and Consovoy McCarthy, don't know how to pronounce his name, or her name, not sure, say that Sage Publishing violated California contract law when it yanked 3 studies, including 2 on the dangers of the abortion pill earlier this year. The retractions, which occurred weeks before the Supreme Court heard arguments on the availability of abortion pills, were first reported by the Daily Wire. The bottom line is that these so-called scientists performed actual science that produced actual results showing that these abortion pills are pretty dangerous, actually. Speaking of the mother, of course, they're also pretty dangerous to the child that's being murdered, just FYI. And then they suppress the data, so the agenda of being able to just, sell these pills through the mail and over the counter, and I think put them as prizes in cereal boxes next to the tampon machines that Timmy Walls put in the boys' bathrooms, etc., could be carried out by the butchers such as Planned Parenthood and the Democratic Party as a whole, along with and in conjunction with Moloch and Baal and the big cheese himself, Satan. And this is what happens when science no longer does science, when we simply work off of hypotheticals and agenda and political policy or abject fantasy while ignoring the realities of the world around us. Unfortunately, this is what science, certain aspects of science, has become. Take SpaceX and Tesla, for instance. Both the electric vehicle and the rockets are amazing scientific achievements. Whether you like them or not, they are. But the reason that Elon Musk is doing these things is because he's a firm believer that climate change will destroy the planet soon-ish. He didn't create Tesla as such, but he's pushed the electric vehicle as a method of trying to stave off heat death of this planet for enough time to get us to another planet so the human race can survive. And that's why he did create SpaceX. Now, he sends up Starlink and random satellites, supply missions, astronauts. He rescues stranded astronauts, etc. for one purpose only, to create a rocket that can get to Mars and back in order to set up a Martian colony for humans in order to shuttle them to Mars before the Earth dies due to climate change. His science is amazing, but the science behind his science is garbage because it's not science. He's using highly disputed data with the foundation of evolution in order to claim that climate change is out of control and will continue that way and it'll wipe out the Earth. And that's in no way scientific. Same with the evolution theory. It's not science. When you discount one entire plausible theory, namely biblical creation, for the origin of everything, you're not doing science. When you're hypothesizing things that can't be replicated or tested or confirmed, you're not doing science. You're in the realm of a religion, albeit a very distorted man-centered humanist religion, with absolutely no reason for it to exist. Evolution is a stupid theory based on garbage science, flat out. When you start to look into it beyond just the surface level, it falls apart. As scientists, so-called, are finding out, which is why they must keep updating, elongating, creating new, even more implausible hypotheses. And the actions we're taking or not taking, based on some good and some bad scientists, all doing bad science, are hurting people. And that's not okay. That's not science. That's Nazi science. Withholding data that says abortion pills can severely harm or kill the woman is criminal. Withholding data that says these so-called COVID vaccines are incredibly dangerous and deadly while trying to force the narrative that everyone must have one for your own personal agenda is criminal. Science should be based in and on reality. And we can discuss hypotheticals like infinite monkeys banging at keyboards for infinite years, but why? What is the point of that? It's simply stating that anything is possible. But no, not anything is possible. There are laws that have been established. There are facts that can't be changed. There are realities that are not open for interpretation. And this is why, although the Bible isn't a science textbook, it absolutely must be our starting point for anything to do with life, anything to do with this existence, this universe. That's why scientific inquiry in the various fields started in the first place. To think God's thoughts after him, to try to discover the majesty of God's creation by trying to figure out what he was doing, what he was thinking. Now, I have no problem analyzing theories that say there's no God, but let's do it honestly. And then, when all your hypotheses fail, and they have, and they do, and they will, then openly and honestly admit the truth that there is a God. Now, I have no problem with creating and testing novel vaccines. But let's be honest about what the data shows. I do have a problem with the creation of abortion pills, not because of the pills themselves, but because the science behind that science is garbage. Somehow claiming that a tiny human that we can't directly see isn't a human, that's not science. That's evil. There are multiple kinds of science. There's real science and theoretical science and junk science. We seem to be getting more and more of the latter these days, science that's adjusted, manipulated, and propagated for the purposes of agenda. That's junk science. It's not good. It's not real. As Christians, we are not allowed to separate our beliefs from science, as science cannot exist absent God. Laws and rules need someone to create and maintain them. Nature is not that thing, and evolution would constantly be changing them. I read this in Proverbs 8 just recently, and this is Lady Wisdom, right? Proverbs speaks of wisdom as a woman. Lady Wisdom is speaking here. Quote, Yahweh possessed me at the beginning of his way, before his deeds of old. From everlasting I was installed, from the beginning, from the earliest times of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs heavy with water. Before the mountains were settled, before the hills, I was brought forth. While he had not yet made the earth and the fields outside, nor the first dust of the world. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he marked out a circle on the face of the deep, when he made firm the skies above, when the springs of the deep became strong, when he set for the sea its boundary so that the water would not pass over his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him as a master workman, and I was a daily delight, rejoicing always before him, rejoicing in the world, his earth, my delight is in the sons of men. Wisdom existed before anything that we see or don't see. Wisdom is a gift from God, but it's not just magically given. It must be sought. It must be desired. Man has disregarded wisdom, choosing instead knowledge and intelligence. And as wisdom comes from God, man, absent God, denying God, is unable to think and reason wisely. Christians, although imperfect, are those who are wise in the world. The more we seek God, the more we meditate on his word, the more wisdom we glean. When you peel away all the layers of science today, we find that the fields of science started with, but now woefully lack, true godly wisdom. They rely almost entirely on knowledge and intelligence, which admittedly leads to amazing discoveries and inventions and improvements for life, but pulls man farther and farther from God and reality. And that, in an ever-expanding way, is why we are where we are today with regard to the futility, ridiculousness, and in some cases evil of so-called science. For the 10th time, we've gone around the horn, and here we are again, being Bereans. It's like magic. Wait, that will probably get me stoned, especially where we are in the Old Testament. It's like providence. Okay, so let's be Bereans chapter 10. Let's do this. All right, sir, do your thing.
This is your fair warning. Look, what follows is nothing but the ravings of a madman. No time should you listen to a thing that this Looney Tune has to say. What's that? Who get paid? What you're about to hear, the thoughts, questions, revelations, not like them wagadoodle charismatic types. The host of the Logical Christian Podcast. This guy, as hard as it may be to believe, well, sir, he ain't perfect. Never claimed to be as such, but he sure do try mighty hard to get things right. That said, if he does get something wrong, which may happen once in a coon's age, ain't you here being a brilliant? Ain't you supposed to catch you in mistakes? And for good measure, ye need to tell on, keep him from getting too big for his britches. And alright, y'all been warned. Keep your ears open. That's all I got to say about that.
Okay, well, that was something. Let's just all back away slowly. When we last met, we were all the way to chapter 13 or so in Deuteronomy. Yes, already. Nearly done, I think. To be honest, I really haven't looked ahead. I didn't want to know how the book ended, but surely we're getting close, right? So the Mosaic Law was brutal. I think we can probably agree on that, and although I can't see how we could ever advocate to go back to exactly that, there is still some merit in the spirit of the law. Case in point, chapter 13, verse 6 through the end of the chapter, and I'm going to summarize and kind of paraphrase this for the sake of time. If your brother, your mother's son, or your son or daughter, or the wife you cherish, or your friend who is as your own soul entices you secretly, saying, "Let us go and serve other gods," you shall not be willing to accept him or listen to him, and your eye shall not pity him, and you shall not spare him or conceal him, but you shall surely kill him. Your hand shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterwards the hand of all the people. So you shall stone him to death, because he has sought to drive you from Yahweh your God, who brought you out from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Thus all Israel will hear and be afraid, and will never again do such an evil thing among you. If you hear in one of your cities, which Yahweh your God is giving you to live in, anyone saying that some vile men have gone out from among you, and have driven the inhabitants of their city astray, saying, "Let us go and serve other gods," then you shall inquire and search out and ask thoroughly. Behold, if it is true and the matter is confirmed that this abomination has been done among you, you shall surely strike the inhabitants of that city with the edge of the sword, devoting it to destruction, and all that is in it, and its cattle, with the edge of the sword. Then you shall gather all its spoil into the middle of its open square, and burn the city and all its spoil with fire as a whole burnt offering to Yahweh your God, and it shall be a ruin forever. It shall never be rebuilt. Like I said, it'd be a little difficult to advocate for that exactly these days, but the point, I think, is valid. Right? You make an example of the person who committed the atrocity, a public example, so as to put the fear of God or the fear of the justice system into the rest of the population. Can you imagine if we did that with murderers, child molesters, rapists? I've advocated for this for a while now, a long while. Look, we have live streaming to nearly everywhere from anywhere. I think executions should be done swiftly. And this is what we see in the passage we just looked at. There wasn't, decades of appeals. There was no sitting in a jail cell. There was no giving the offender the chance to reform. There was justice for actions. We do this swiftly, decisively, and publicly. No, this would not deter all criminal activity. This didn't deter all law-breaking back in the days of Moses. But I bet it would really make people think more than twice before doing what they otherwise might just go and do. Now, in all reality, and this will be controversial, The Muslims, again, in concept, aren't wrong by how they enact justice for broken laws. The questions, I think, in their case would be, is the penalty really befitting the crime, and are the laws just in the first place? But the reality, even in their case, is that swift and public justice is a massive deterrent to crime. The problem that we would have is the same that the Muslims have. There's just little to no connection with the one true God anymore. So, as sinful humans, we'd screw this up. Even if we, speaking of the United States, even if we had very specific cases that this would apply to, the most egregious or the most heinous acts and crimes, that would eventually slip down that old slope and we'd end up with something like the purge, but it would be government-sanctioned purging and the rules would constantly be changing based on who was in power. But like I said, the concept is solid. Unfortunately, our justice system has become a joke. We lock up grandma for wandering around the Capitol at the wrong time, and we let the hardened criminals go because if we don't, we're being racist or something. Skipping ahead to Deuteronomy 15, just a brief word here. This is giving the law of every 7 years there would be a remission of debts and a returning of borrowed property. This is the sabbatical year or the Shemitah. This would be another interesting concept to try, right? So every 7 years, if you borrowed from someone, your debt, wherever it stood, would be forgiven. The books would be wiped clean. If you borrowed something, you give it back. And then every 50 years, so 7 complete 7-year cycles, next year, the 50th year, all property that was purchased from another person would revert back to the original owner. Now, there were specific reasons for this. There were caveats, right? None of this applied to foreigners. This was all for the chosen people of God. This was only for the Jewish nation in the promised land. And as we're told in chapter 15, verse 4, quote, "There will be no needy one among you, since Yahweh will surely bless you in the land which Yahweh your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess, if only you listen obediently to the voice of Yahweh your God, to be careful to do all this commandment which I am commanding you today." That was Moses telling the Israelites that if they worship and obey God as he has commanded, they won't need to borrow from each other. They won't need to lend especially at some sort of interest rate. They'll all be blessed with abundance. Of course, that didn't happen. But another interesting concept. And notice that the government was not involved. See, I can hear someone say now, well, if you like the idea of debt forgiveness, then why aren't you in favor of student loan forgiveness? Well, a number of reasons. We won't go into all of them here. But government-sponsored wealth redistribution, that's one, taking from the poor and giving to the rich. Etc., etc. See, as I said, we don't see the government involved in chapter 15. And make no mistake, Moses was the head of the government. The governing body was the priesthood, the Levites. The tithe, which does not apply to today, was their form of taxes. Those tithes, which was not 10%, it was closer to 30% when you average it out, those tithes came into the tabernacle, which was the center of their theocracy. Now, what chapter 15 is talking about is how we interact with our neighbors. It's about each of us individually taking care of those in need, not government-sponsored welfare. It's about us loaning goods or money to those who have an unusual need for free, no interest charged, rather than a bank or a credit agency loaning money in order that they can make money. Now, this was brother to brother, neighbor to neighbor. This is taking care of your fellow man, not a business for greedy gain or a government choosing who lives and who dies. Again, an interesting concept, and we can see small sparks of this kind of thing happen between individuals from time to time, but I bet we couldn't get the best, most godly church body to live in a microcosm like this. How soon would it fall to infighting, slandering, gossiping, and then, of course, the lawsuits? I would guess pretty quickly. Moving to chapter 16, the justice system. Quote, "You shall appoint for yourself judges and officers, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. You shall not distort justice. You shall not be partial, and you shall not take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and perverts the words of the righteous. Righteousness you shall pursue." Our Supreme Court, being the highest court in the land, has been an object of argument for some time now. Now that Roe v. Wade has been overturned, which was a poorly ruled judgment in the first place, ignoring the subject matter, we now apparently have a, quote, conservative court. And yeah, on paper we do. In reality, wow, have a few of those so-called conservative judges just been a massive disappointment. And did you know that those judges are actually apolitical? Yeah, they hold a political preference in their personal lives, but they're completely impartial when they're donning the robes, right? Yeah. So the fact that we have a political partisanship in the Supreme Court, or any court, shows how much we've devolved as a society. What we should have are judges who follow the Constitution first, and then look at other laws, and then look to case law. But really, if the cases are all judged based on the Constitution first, then the laws and the case law would be moot, as they'd agree with the Constitution. Unfortunately, that's not what we have today. Everything must be partisan. Lady Justice may not have fully ripped off the blindfold, spinning it around on her outstretched finger as she drunkenly shouts, "Woo!" But she sure is peeking all around that thing, isn't she? When this drops, this episode drops, we're in theory a day away from finding out who our next president will be. Now, it may take a week or a month or 4 more years before we get the final tally. Who knows? But in theory, we're a day away. I can tell you that if it's the Marxist current vice president, who nobody liked, nobody voted for, nobody wanted, but was just installed in that position like all good democracies, by the way, we're not a democracy, then I have no doubt she'll push to add another 4 justices to the Supreme Court, because that's what they've been talking about. And they will be the most liberal of any justice we've seen in our history. And that will be done in order to balance the court, as she'll claim, or in reality to slam the court hard left in order to mandate whatever she'd like, or more accurately, to mandate whatever her overlords are demanding that she mandates. The question is, could she push the court packing scheme through, and could she get her appointments through? And I don't think she could. I really don't. But I don't know that for sure. The best thing is to ensure she never slips her demonic little self behind the resolute desk. Okay, now the quick point. After speaking about justice, Moses moves to not worshiping anything that's not Yahweh God, not sacrificing animals to Yahweh that are blemished in some way, not doing evil. And if someone does violate these commands upon a trial, upon the sworn testimony, the witness of 2 or 3 people, the guilty person will be brought outside the city gates and killed, with the accusers, the witnesses, being the first to throw stones. And this phrase, quote, "so you shall purge the evil from your midst," that appears at the end of this little section. And if you look up the word purge in the LSB version of the Bible, you'll find it 15 times in 15 verses, 11 of which are in Deuteronomy, all speaking of purging the evil from the camp or from your midst or something along those lines. Do you think that God took his command seriously? We're told to hate the sin but love the sinner. We're supposed to enact all sorts of rehabilitation programs and gather teams of psychiatrists in order to evaluate and work with people. But God said, if you have someone doing evil, purge the evil. Or as I like to say, cleanse the camp. You get the cancer out. Just out, gone. You don't play with cancer. Why are we playing with cancer inside our society? If you look at this, for example, current transgender abomination, I'm not saying to kill them all, right? Well, let's not kill most of them. Those who are committing crimes, these violent crimes, because of the psychotic derangement that they're suffering from, they should be tried quickly, convicted quickly, and executed for their crimes quickly. But the vast majority, I'm not saying we commit a genocide, but they need to be shoved back into hiding, in my humble opinion. It needs to be made very clear that this is an abomination. It's degenerate. It's not acceptable, and we're not playing with this societal cancer any longer. As long as they abide by the law, now you can get some psychiatrists, counselors, etc. to work with them to try to fix what's broken in their heads and, more importantly, their souls. But the evil must not be allowed to fester, or as we're seeing in the United States, that cancer will turn aggressive stage 4 before we had any idea what was going on. And I guess we'll finish chapter 18 and then get on out of here. Chapter 18 finishes where we left off last time, basically, with the beginning of chapter 13, false prophets. Moses told the Israelites that God would raise up a prophet for them, a person who would speak for God as God speaks to him. Moses explains why the prophet is needed. Quote, "This is according to all that you asked of Yahweh your God in Horeb on the day of the assembly, saying, let me not hear again the voice of Yahweh my God. Let me not see this great fire anymore, or I will die. And Yahweh said to me, they have spoken well. I will raise up a prophet from among their brothers like you, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him." So Moses gave them two caveats to this prophet that the Israelites must be aware of and adhere to. First, listen and do what you're told through the prophet, or else. And then second, quote, "But the prophet who speaks a word presumptuously in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or which he speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet," one guess, "shall die." The key to knowing if the person is a false prophet was if what he said came true. Most prophecies in the Bible, as I understand it, have kind of a short-term and a long-term prophetic meaning. If you have someone who says, "and God says," or "and God told me," or something like that, about 90% of those you'll see on TBN or Daystar, channels like that, or these YouTube prophets nowadays. If what they say doesn't come to pass, they're supposed to die. The 2020 presidential election would have literally wiped out nearly 100% of all of these so-called modern-day prophets and apostles, at least the people that are alleging to be. They all prophesied that Trump had already won. Now, you can argue that he did and he was cheated. Maybe, maybe not. Doesn't matter. Either way, that's not what they were saying. And somehow, old President Vegetable has been the guy in the Oval for nearly the full 4 years, which is shocking in itself. That was what these prophets were prophesying, is that Trump was going to be in the Oval for the 4 years, and they were all wrong. Now, in the Old Testament days, they would have all been brought out and stoned, purging the evil from the camp. And on that happy note, if you haven't voted, look, it's tomorrow. When this drops, it'll be tomorrow. Get out and vote. And vote Republican. Yes, I know, we're not supposed to tell you how to vote. Oh, just vote your conscience, vote your... Blah. Let's stop playing with it. Treat it the way justice should be done. Let's just be blunt with this, okay? Vote Republican. It's your duty to vote, and as a Christian, it's your duty to vote for the candidate who most closely aligns with the Bible. Not your feelings. Nobody cares about those. The Bible, God's Word, that is your guidebook. That's not to say there's a perfect candidate, because we are far from having one of those. But unless you refuse to bank, shop, eat, work, or otherwise interact with anyone who isn't a 100% blood-bought, Jesus-like individual or company, your argument that Trump isn't very godly or you can't vote for him because he's not whatever, it holds no water. It's a stupid argument, frankly. And you aren't stupid. You can't be. You're listening to this. Just saying. So go vote. Although we know that God holds this election in his hands, that God will install his choice for this nation, we are responsible for our actions or our inactions. I think abortion, child mutilation, unrestrained sex trafficking, man, woman, and child, and unrestrained drug trafficking into this nation, among so many other things, is enough to say we must vote for the person most likely to fight against that, and that person is Donald Trump. Love him or hate him. Okay, so we'll find out shortly how the next 4 years will go, but until then, during that, and on into the future, keep reading, keep studying, keep praying. As always, let me know what you think, give me feedback, ask questions, tell me what you're learning. Now, get up, get off your duff, go vote, and go be a Berean. And with that, sadly, we've reached the end of yet another episode of the Logical Christian Podcast. I feel we've bonded as we've laughed and cried and twisted our faces in incredulity. If you've enjoyed or found value in what you've heard, go on and do all the podcast things. And don't forget to check the show notes for links and contact info. Lawrence J. Peters said, "Against logic there is no armor like ignorance." Jesus told us that if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So stay in the word, stay logical, stay faithful, and until next time, God bless.